Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Hi, I'm Gabe Lyons. Welcome back to the Q Podcast. This is our 6th episode in a series. For many of you who've been with us this entire time, we've been having this conversation, a conversation that's not easy to have. It's one that delves into all kinds of discussions and areas where we don't necessarily feel like we can give proper time to everything we'd like to talk about. And so we've tried to create space in this final episode to answer your questions. And so over these last several weeks, we've received several questions from you wondering, things we didn't address, how would we respond to them? And I have with me Preston Sprinkle, author of the book, People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. Welcome back, Preston.
Hey, it's great to be back, Gabe. Thanks for having me back.
So I know you and I have been looking forward to this part of the conversation because for so much of this, it has been you and I back and forth having these conversations. This last episode, we had Russ Moore talking more about the politics and public square side of things. But, hearing people's voices on this and the feedback has just been one of those things that we weren't quite sure what we were going to hear. When you put out a conversation called The Gay Conversation, you pretty much know it's going to create a little bit of stir. And no matter how well I know that we've tried to do this and handle this, we've gotten some negative feedback, and we've also got a ton of positive feedback. What's your reaction been to the reaction to this series, Preston?
Well, like you said, whenever you go public with your views on homosexuality, no matter what you do, no matter how generous you try and be or how much you listen to other people and get different perspectives, there's always going to be criticism. And I've found this out over the years that no matter what I say, somebody will disagree with me. And I've gotten a lot of criticism from both sides of this debate. I mean, I get people on the conservative side who say, you're too nice, you just need to keep quoting Bible verses and end of the discussion. I get people on the other side that say, you're not nice enough until you're affirming, you're not really loving me. And so it is hard to navigate these waters. But I again, just to reaffirm what you said, our desire is to get as much feedback and truly have a conversation, not just with people that agree with us. I mean, some of the questions we got, are really good questions and express a measure of disagreement. And we do welcome that. I mean, with a podcast, it's hard to have a genuine conversation. It's not like we're sitting down with somebody over coffee for 2 hours conversing, but we have invited a lot of different people into this discussion, and I've really learned a lot through it.
Well, and I think that is one of the feedbacks we've gotten is you called this a conversation, but was every person represented that's in this conversations well? Did they get enough time to state their opinions, or did you just kind of use certain statements? And I guess what I would say is that's a fair critique. I mean, we basically did try to put together a series that captured some of the best of conversations you and I have been having for years. I mean, this isn't just, hey, let's come get on microphones and start sharing some private conversation that we haven't actually played out over years with several friends, people we agree with, people we disagree with, lots of reading. And so what we were trying to do is bring a very complex conversation to people who don't think about this all the time, but who have real questions and real concerns and real compassion about the church not doing this well and trying to figure out what is the way forward here. One of the things I would say is, 93% of quote unquote evangelical pastors, and in recent research that the Barna Group did, say that they do hold to the historic sexual ethic, and this theology for them is unchanging. It's grounded. It's something that they're not budging on. And so when you get that kind of response, you realize the conversation we're trying to have is to help those who aren't going to change their theology know what does it look like for us to live faithfully, to hold to what we believe, but that doesn't mean we have to be demonstrably mean, and we don't have to be condemning to people who disagree. Even those who absolutely are opposed to what we're doing, we want to be generous and welcoming and inviting into this conversation so that their perspectives aren't left out. And so we've tried to do that, and I'm sure there's some good criticism about some voice we left out or a certain perspective, but I can say we've done our best.
And trying to get a diverse array of perspectives is really tough. I mean, where does that where does that end? I mean, we didn't have, elderly people over 80 on the show. We didn't have a kid's perspective. We didn't even have a global perspective. I mean, we could have, emailed people in Africa and said, you need to weigh in on this. And what's your thoughts? I mean, we did try to get a decent amount of diversity on the show, people who are in ministry working through this, people who are biblical scholars working through these questions, people who are gay, lesbian, who are experiencing the things we're talking about. And, I'll be the first one to say, yeah, we could have been even more diverse. But again, with you, Gabe, I think we did try hard not to make this just the Gabe and Preston show, but to try to get a lot of people speaking it.
Yeah, and I would just say, just for full disclosure and clarity, we invited a lot of people to be a part of this who just simply didn't want to be on the air talking about this. I mean, it just speaks to the toxic nature of this conversation that plenty of people who have great things to say and would have added more to this conversation, they just simply weren't willing to sort of put themselves out there and go public and have this kind of a conversation. So the good news is I think we've got a lot of great voices that participated in this. And I think just acknowledging that, hey, we think there's probably another 100 voices that could have been a part of it. But when you're putting together a podcast series, you do your best to make sure as many people are represented as possible. And we try to walk our listeners through hearing those stories, understanding where people are coming from, and then figuring out how do we move forward. Okay, so we got your questions, and we have some good ones here, Preston, that I think are interesting. I mean, they range from theology to ministry. So I just want to jump right in with one of the first ones, and here it is. This person asks, can we view homosexual marriage similarly to divorce or polygamy, where it's not ideal, but it's something that God may in time allow even to be considered normative among his people, even if he continues to not view it as ideal and a proper reflection of his design for marriage? So here you have this, it's a comparison between divorce and same-sex marriage. That's been made a lot. It seems to be the first thing people ask when they say, hey, if you're not for same-sex marriage, are you for divorce and remarriage? And it kind of undercuts the theological argument to say that you're for this historic sexual ethic. So talk to me about how you view that.
That's a really good question. When I think about divorce and polygamy, when you look at it in the wider scriptural narrative, you do see much more allowance in the Old Testament. But the problem is when you follow the biblical trajectory, you see more of a narrowing, if you will, of the marriage ethic towards monogamy and towards fidelity, where divorce is even more strict in the New Testament. So I don't see the direction of a Christian ethic moving towards this sort of allowance. Now, let me jump in too and say, I think that us evangelical heterosexuals generally have done a very poor job at making allowances for divorce and yet coming down super hard on same-sex relations. So I think we need to first of all repent of that and say, no, if we're gonna take the Bible seriously, we need to be consistent and advocate for a consistent ethic. But I don't think that means that since we've been sort of lenient on divorce, or since there's some ambiguity in the Old Testament here, that therefore we should map that same inconsistency or leniency on same-sex relations.
Well, I would just add that the thing about divorce that seems to not be congruent with how most people would try to connect these two is that we don't celebrate divorce in our communities. We don't say, hey, divorce is a good. That's something in our community we're going to celebrate and affirm and lift up. Obviously, there are some cases where there's abuse or there's something going on where a church or a pastor would say, hey, in this situation, there's justification for you to separate and divorce from your spouse. However, the way in which this is being discussed today to try to compare it to divorce is not equal because in the same-sex marriage discussion, it would be that our churches are supposed to affirm this, say this is a good for you, this is a good for our community, we're going to celebrate it, we're going to acknowledge it, and we just don't do that with divorce. And I think a lot of people forget about that when they try to make this comparison.
I've got a friend who was a missionary in northern Nigeria where polygamy was part of the culture. It was just part of the very economic structure of the culture. And he went in as a missionary, and he decided through much wrestling with himself and with others and everything, that he would allow polygamous men to be members. But even he said, that his ultimate goal was over time to move them towards monogamy as God's ideal. So even there, he sort of did make an allowance, because he said if he just said no polygamous man can ever be baptized, like that, it just wouldn't work. He's jumping into a polygamous culture, but he was moving towards monogamy. So even there, it's not really an allowance in the sense that it's, like you said, celebrating it. He's moving towards monogamy.
Okay, the next question that we had was this. What ways can we actually recover a historic Christian ethic for singleness that makes it in some ways more effective for God's kingdom? So how can we actually encourage gay people to find their unique calling for God's kingdom? So it's a question about this idea. We talked a little bit about this, about how the church hasn't done so well with the singleness discussion. And what do you think it's going to take for the church to kind of wake up to this? Because I hear this complaint all the time, Preston, where people who are in their 20s and they're not married and they're not sure if they'll ever get married feel like they're treated as this subcategory within their congregations. Like they're supposed to go be part of the singles group or the singles class, and they're not being like connected with other generations. And it's treated like they're only in some stage of life. And of course, one day they'll graduate to being married. So what do you think are ways churches can create a better culture for people who are not married and maybe never will be?
That's another great question. And yeah, we did touch on it before, but just to reiterate, I think that we first of all need to believe as a church that singleness is not just a stage to get through, but is a gift from God to be celebrated and used for his kingdom. What's fascinating is in the Bible, in 1 Corinthians 7, and even in the life of Jesus and even in early church, singleness was like elevated. Like it was seen as like, here's the best avenue to pursue. Now, it's not wrong to get married, but they would elevate singleness almost higher than marriage in some contexts. And I think we've reversed that. We've seen marriage as almost necessary to fully live out your humanity. I just don't think that that's biblically true. So I think what we need to do, first of all, Gabe, is just to revisit what the scriptures say about singleness and how highly it elevates it.
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity for the church to respond to this, to see this as a bit of a wake-up call for how we've handled people who are single, and to repent even of how we've handled that, and to start to create flourishing communities where people start to see them as part of a household that has many types of people in it. People who are single, of an older generation, some who are married, some who are single mothers or single fathers, that this community of people would come together and find in that community something beautiful that you can't just find if you're talking about just immediate families or if you're just talking about marriage to a spouse, and to find that kind of relational fulfillment that I think we all long for. The church should be the first place people are finding it, not a place where they start to feel separated out and divided amongst one another.
Right.
Let's move into another question that's a little more about like sort of public policy. And this is a tough one. You know, it's a question about this. What if you work somewhere? So imagine like a Fortune 500 company, and there are policies in place, or even if you work somewhere like federal government. We saw this story play out this last year. Kim Davis in Kentucky, who was a clerk who was by law needed to issue marriage licenses, and yet personally said, I can't do that. As a Christian, I'm not going to do that. It's against my conscience. And she ended up going to jail for several days around that certain case. But what should a Christian do who's in a place where the government or their authorities are asking them to do something that supports maybe same-sex marriage, and they personally just disagree with it? They have a deep conflict with it. What are we recommending that they do, Preston?
Oh man, where's
go
Wes
to jail?
Moore?
I mean, do we want them to go to jail? Is that what you're saying?
Oh man, let me just. These are my working thoughts, Gabe. I think this is definitely a big gray area, and I think Christians again need to feel the freedom to think through these questions and err on one side or the other. I don't think there's a black and white answer to this. Here's how I handle questions like these. I think that Christians have had such a horrible, loud, obnoxious posture in this conversation. And I think when there is gray, my perspective is, let's err on the side of being generous. Let's err on the side of being kind. If it's a black and white question, like for instance, for me, a black and white question is as a licensed minister, given my theological views, I can't officiate a gay wedding. To me, that's black and white. Now, attending a gay wedding, I know this is a different set of questions maybe we'll get into, but attending, to me, that's gray. So I'm gonna err on the side of being kind, of being known for my love, not for my law. That doesn't mean I don't have a certain view, and that doesn't mean I'm sacrificing my convictions. It just means that I'm living in a pluralistic, broken world. There's societal structures all around me that I don't agree with. I mean, I work for companies that don't love their enemies. I work for companies that are led by greedy people. Like we just live in a societal web of sinful structures. And I think we need to err on the side of kindness, acknowledging that we're going to have to give in a little bit.
Well, I think, Preston, the dilemma is when you work for a company, or say you're working in a sort of a federal job and the law states you have to perform these duties, should there be an out? Should your conscience in any way be able to dictate that you're not going to participate in something that you feel like violates your conscience? And I know we've seen that with I guess bakers, photographers, but specifically like the Kim Davis story, that one in Kentucky where she's supposed to deliver marriage licenses and ultimately went to jail for that. And I think the point was what she was arguing for, I guess, was that she needed an accommodation. So historically in American life, we have had accommodations for people to not have to violate their conscience because we believe that's a good thing. Now, I know gay rights groups and many have made the point that this is being overused. It's just a way to kind of keep sort of holding people back and religious extremism alive. But I do think there's a valid point to this idea. It's not just for Christians. I mean, we should be able to accommodate those who believe nothing at all. We should be able to accommodate Muslims and their beliefs to not be forced to do something that's against what they believe. We've done it for centuries for those who are pacifist, who they don't have to participate specifically in battle and in the military because of their pacifist points of view. So I think that's a discussion that will happen and continue to play out in American life as people kind of settle down and don't just see this as a constant battle between LGBT rights and the religious groups, but that we see it as like an American value that we really want to respect, not forcing people to do things that violate their conscience. So another question, Preston, that came up, and this is one that's really interesting, just a way of phrasing it. This person asked, is celebrating one's quote-unquote gayness, apart from actually participating in gay sexual acts, a permissible or beautiful and a good thing? To what extent is gayness and lesbianness redeemable, or is it just a social construct we should all buy into?
Let me give you two different perspectives that I've held on this type of question. I used to think that being gay could be reduced to your sexual desires. Like being gay meant you want to have sex with people the same gender. Now, that was a perspective I had before I talked to gay and lesbian people. But after talking to friends of mine like Justin Lee and Wes Hill and Julie Rogers and others, and really heard their perspective on what it means to be gay, it opened up my mind to how complex and holistic their gay identity is. And so, I don't know, I really wrestle with this, Gabe.
Well, because they would say, what you're saying is if somebody defines being gay as more than just sexual attractions, like that would be the newer kind of construct, right? I mean, in the older days, let's say, when you said you were gay, in many ways it meant it was very tied to attraction. And now there's a lot more of a social construct around it that says, no, being gay has to do with just how I experience life in every way. It's bigger than that. I mean, explain
it just
more
means
about
that you're.
that.
Yeah, well, I think Justin said it perfectly. He says, when I say the word gay, it just means that I'm attracted to the same sex. But he says the fact that I'm attracted to the same sex, that affects how I relate to women. That affects how I relate to other men that I'm not like sexually attracted to, but they're just men. I mean, it affects so many things about the daily routine of my life. And a lot of that isn't sin. Even from a traditional point of view, I think there is a lot about the experience of being gay, if we look at it more holistically, that we can't reduce to, oh, this is just sin and you shouldn't celebrate that. So I do think that there are aspects, again, I'm speaking as a straight person who I'm just trying to understand from the perspective of my gay and lesbian friends what they're saying, but from their perspective, I would say, yeah, I think there are a lot of things about being gay that are redeemable, good, and beautiful. What do you think, Gabe? You gotta go ahead and push back.
I really don't know. I mean, it's this definition, it's the terms thing, and I think it's just the challenge of terms and how we use them and how we mean them. And certain people mean them one way, and others mean them the other way. And so I think language is a big part of this conversation. And so when we talk about and define someone's quote unquote gayness as a gift and as something to be celebrated, I think it can be a little confusing about how do you define gayness outside of what it traditionally has meant, which has been very much to do with attractions and desire, and not so much to do with just personality traits and temperament. So, but let's move on to the next question, because I don't think we have a perfect answer to that, and I think probably there's other people who could speak more to this who are gay or who might hold that perspective, and they'd probably have more important and helpful things to say to it than you or I.
Yeah, I would just before we leave this question, I would encourage our audience that ask your gay and lesbian friend about their experience of being gay. Like, I think that's the best way, rather than say, like, here's what your gayness means. I don't like the term gayness really,
right.
but this is what it means to be gay, and we're going to tell you what it means, and it's all sin or whatever. Like, instead of having that posture, let's go to them and ask them, you tell me about what it means to be gay from morning, noon, evening, and in this setting and that setting, and so that we can, as straight people, we can have a more holistic perspective on it.
Yeah, good. Okay, let's move to the next question. I mean, this question has to do, continuing in this discussion around just relationships, and here's the question: how can we maintain deep, intimate relationship with someone whose actions say that she will only feel loved if I affirm everything about her life? How do I maintain an intimate relationship with someone when I can't celebrate the joy she feels about her relationship? How do I maintain intimate relationships with people who will only feel loved if I affirm everything about them? And this does get into this friendship space where we have friends who might differ theologically or who aren't at the same place. And so are we just saying you should be friends along those differences, or is it really possible? This is, I think, a dilemma a lot of people are struggling with and are going to continue to struggle with, especially Christians who hold to the historic point of view as they're in friendship with other Christians who don't.
It's a really tough question. And the hard thing about this particular question is that there's so many different types of relationships that could fit within this category that the question is asking. So it really depends on the relationship. I mean, I can share a whole bunch of stories of people who disagree on this question, and yet they understand where each side is coming from, and they're able to maintain a real rich, vibrant relationship. One guy in particular, he's a Christian father, and his son is gay, and they've really wrestled with this. But man, the son just completely respects where his father's coming from, doesn't judge him, doesn't think he's old-fashioned, doesn't think he's a bigot. The father absolutely unconditionally loves his son. They actually work together in a construction business, and they have this massive disagreement, and yet they are able to maintain a true, authentic relationship. So I do think it's possible. I don't know. What do you think? It seems like it takes both sides, though, to be able to love.
Yeah, and I think there has to be clarity in the relationship. There has to be an openness to be able to share honestly about maybe what you believe. If you're having this discussion, a theological discussion about what one believes, and that's invited. And I think it's important, as you've said and we've talked about throughout this series, that the posture has to be one of love and welcoming and accepting and being friends with those who are different and who might not ever see it the way you see it, even if they never, quote unquote, convert to your way of thinking. What does it look like to truly be loving and kind and to be the one that says, I'm not going to walk away from this relationship, to say, hey, if you want to walk away, if you feel like you just can't be friends with me because I don't share your theological view, then that's a choice you might make to walk away, but I am not going to walk away from this friendship just because we disagree about this. And I think if both sides are willing to make those kind of commitments, then we'll find our way through this. If somebody says, look, I just can't because it harms me to be around you because I know what your attitude is or I know what you're thinking behind the scenes, like I'm sure as any of our friendships can kind of go that route, there's the chance it could go that route. But I think we should do the hard work, especially in this discussion, to say, I want to be friends. I'm not going to walk away from this relationship just because we disagree. And
I don't think it's even healthy relationally for one party in that relationship to say, unless you affirm everything I do, we can't be friends. Unless you affirm everything I do, you're not really loving me. That's just a weird relationship. I don't know any relationships that I'm involved in that, where I say, you can't speak into my life. You can't say anything about my desires, what I'm doing here. Like a good relationship, a healthy relationship is one where people are mutually speaking into each other's life and challenging and, within the context of love and grace, but for someone to say this part of my life is untouched, that's not a genuine relationship to my mind.
Okay, and this is the final question, Preston, and this gets into this discussion around attractions and whether they can change. And I think it comes from somebody who holds to the historic sexual ethic that we've discussed. And the person says, is our only option as believers to walk with our fellow believers while they continue to struggle with same-sex attraction? Or do we believe that those attractions can be reversed? They say, I want to believe that God's healing and making all things new is possible, but I'm discouraged when I hear so few stories that people actually experience this change.
Yeah, that's such a volatile question. I know we dove into it a little bit in the podcast, but I just want to say, look, I'm not a psychologist. I've done quite a bit of reading on this topic, but not enough, to speak authoritatively. But from what I've seen, both in the research and in talking to people who have gone down the sort of, change or reparative therapy path, I'm not a big fan, to be quite honest. And at the same time, I don't want to deny that some people have, gone down that path and they have changed and they're super happy. I don't think we should erase anybody's stories, even though some of those stories are threatening to the people that have had a bad experience in reparative therapy. At the same time, just the percentages to me just speak volumes. I mean, there's so many people have not just gone in and not experienced change, but have been tremendously harmed. Some of these stories are just truly heartbreaking, and I've heard there's a couple independent stories I heard of a guy who went into reparative therapy, and they believe that the people doing the therapy believe that it's all nurture, none of it's nature. So there's something in your environment that caused your same-sex attraction. And they convinced the guy, I think these are two different stories, they convinced them that they were sexually abused by their father, even though there's no evidence of that. Now, as a father, I would be pretty upset if somebody convinced my son that I sexually abused him. Like, and I know that's not everybody's story or whatever, but there's enough of those that I've heard that's like, man, like, what are we doing? This is really damaging.
I think the greater point that we've tried to make and that has been acknowledged from so many of the stories of people who still have same-sex attraction but have chosen to live a life of self-denial, who've said, I'm not going to act on those, is that there's a holiness that they've been called to that they're living out. And so this attraction to the same sex is just another thing that tempts them, but it could be different for someone who's straight. It could be, it could be a temptation to overeat. It could be a temptation to do anything that takes us away from what God's best is for us. And the point is that holiness is about denying ourselves through the power of Christ to actually live even despite having, a thorn, so to speak.
Right. We can't reduce holiness to changing from being attracted to the same sex to being straight. Like, once we go that route, I think we go into a theological territory that's just not helpful at all. Holiness does not mean straight.
And people lose hope and they don't see differences. So it's just to say, look, we think there's a big continuum here. That's what the writing is saying. That's what the stories are saying. That's what people who are following Christ and devoted to Him are saying. And so we need to listen to those stories as the church. And we need to understand how to come alongside people in the middle of this. Preston, this is our final episode. I want to thank you for really jumping into this conversation. I know it hasn't been easy. I know it involves a lot of your heart and soul and relationships, but it's been good. You've brought a posture to this that has just been so good, and I hope for our listeners has just reminded them of how deep this is, how deep our love needs to be in the midst of this, to understand that we don't always have all the answers. And it's okay to say that. You've been quick to acknowledge that you don't have certain things figured out, even though you're a theologian, even though you're someone who studies the New Testament, that there's still these areas that we're all kind of working through, and we should be able to acknowledge that.
Well, it's been great to be on, Gabe, and I it is a very heavy discussion. I know a lot of people have avoided it, but I have too many names and faces and friends and stories that this is such a huge part of their life, both who are gay, lesbian, also parents with kids and siblings. And so I'm willing to endure the heaviness like you are, Gabe, and go out and publicly just talk about these things, because we need to cultivate a better way of discussing
Well,
this.
I hope for listeners who've gone through all 6 of these, I mean, this is one of those things where as time goes forward, as you have new friends who are talking about this, or you're part of a church who's wrestling with some of these questions, we hope this can be a resource for you. We hope this is a place you can come back to and listen to these stories and listen to the comments and listen to these questions. And even as you have your own questions, to start to play those out in your own community, to discuss these things, to not be afraid to talk about this. We can't just stay sort of shrouded behind closed doors and having these difficult conversations, as hard as that might be. We need to talk about them, and we're better for talking about them, even if it shows our own bigotry, even if it helps us see where we've been corrupt and how we viewed things. That is a good thing that can come from going through this process, from trying to process your feelings, your experience, and also those of your friends. Preston, just final words. What is your hope for those who've listened through this series as this goes forward? What do you hope they do with this?
My ultimate hope is that people would gain a greater love for people that are gay, lesbian, who are wrestling with their faith and sexuality. At the end of the day, if we're not known for our love, then we're not exemplifying Christ. The Bible says we will be known for our love for one another. So if that is not the byproduct of this conversation, then I think that it's really a failure on our end or on the listener's end. But I really hope that both the conversations we've had with other people, the tone we've tried to emulate, that we will leave conversations like this not more angry, not more fearful, but more hopeful, that love will cover a multitude of sins.
I want to thank all of you for listening to this, to being a part of this. We hope it encourages you as you go forward. And if you want to hear that entire interview that we had with Tim Keller, remember, you can go get that at qideas.org/podcast, where we ask him several questions and get his wisdom on this very complex conversation. And so we hope you'll do that. We hope you'll share this with your friends, so that in the days ahead, more and more of you can be having these conversations.
Hey, this is Gabe, and I want to invite you to join me at Q Denver, April 21st to 23rd, where we're going to take on some of the most difficult topics Christians are having to think about for the year ahead. From the election taking place in 2016, to the legalization of marijuana, to discussions about euthanasia, to the surveillance state that we now live in, terrorism, gun control. All of the hot topics that you're hearing about in the news and in our culture, Q will do our best to address and provide multiple experiences where you get out into the beautiful city of Denver, as well as learn alongside other peers who are trying to consider and grapple with these difficult topics. I hope you'll join us there.